Hi, Mr. Richards here, and today's lesson is factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Our first example has us factoring the polynomial 5x squared plus 27x plus 10. Well, if we identify what is our a, what's our b, what's our c, our a here is equal to 5. Our b is equal to 27, and our c is equal to 10. Now we're going to use the x box method here. So if I draw myself an x, this is going to be 8 times c. Down here is going to be my b. Well, 8 times c in this question is 5 times 10, so that's going to be 50. My b is 27. Now what I'm looking for here are two numbers that together multiply to be 50, that add up to be 27. Those numbers are 25 and 2, as 25 times 2 is 50, and 25 plus 2 is 27. Now comes the box part of our x box. In the top left goes our left term, the 5x squared. In the bottom box goes our last term, which is the 10. And then in these two boxes, we're going to do the 25 and the 2, which make up the 27x. So 25x with that 2x, again, just come from the 27x. Now we're looking for greatest common factors. The greatest common factor of 5x squared and 25x is 5x. The greatest common factor of 2x and 10 is 2. The greatest common factor of 5x squared and 2x is simply x. And then the greatest common factor of 25x and 10 is 5. Now to write this as my factored answer, we're going to have 5x plus 2 times x plus 5. And that is my answer, 5x plus 2 times x plus 5. Our next example is an example where we can look for a greatest common factor first. So if we look at our 4x squared, our 24x, and our 32, is there a number I can divide out of all of those? And you should look for this in all of these questions, really, but that's what this example is about. I can divide out a 2 from all of these, certainly, but I can also divide out a 4. So if I divide a 4 out first, what we're left with is x squared plus 6x plus 8. And now I can do my x box on just this x squared plus 6x plus 8. So my a in this question is now 1, my b is 6, and my c is 8. So I say set up my box with my a times c and my b. My ac is 8, and my b is 6. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to be 8, that add up to be 6. Well, 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 plus 4 is 6, so those are going to be my factors. Now as we move on to the box portion of this, now my first term isn't the 4x squared, it's this thing, so it's going to be x squared. Last term is 8. And then my two other terms, the 2x and the 4x. And if you remember from the previous video, the order in which you put in the 2x and the 4x does not matter. Now as I look for my greatest common factor here, x squared and 2x is going to simply be x. Then 4x and 8, the greatest common factor is 4. X squared and 4x is going to be x. And lastly, 2x and 8 is going to be 2. So as I write my answer here, I do not want to forget about this 4 I pulled out at first. It's going to be 4 times the x plus 2 times the x plus 4. So it's always a good idea to look, is there a greatest common factor that I can pull out first before going into the X box method? So just to practice, is there a greatest common factor I can pull out of here? Well, 22 breaks down to 2 and 11, and I can't get a 2 out of the 3, so in this question there's not. So let's just start off with our A being 24. Our B in this question is negative 22, and our C is equal to 3. So as we look at our box, we're going to look at A times C and B. The B is easy, that's just negative 22. Multiplying A times C, 24 times 3, results in 72. So I'm now looking for two numbers that multiply to be 72, that add up to be negative 22. Well, if I'm getting a negative sum, that means I'm looking for two negative numbers, since a negative times a negative is going to be a positive. Now getting these two may take a little extra work, but I can tell you negative 18 multiplied by negative 4 is going to get you 72. And of course, negative 18 plus negative 4 is negative 22. And so if we set up our box now, first term is 24x squared. Our last term is 3. And we're replacing the negative 22x with negative 18x and negative 4x. So let's look for the greatest common factor here. For the 24x squared and the negative 18x, since the 24x squared is positive, this is going to result in a positive number. And the biggest thing we can pull out of here seems to be a 6x. Next, negative 4x and 3. Not much we can pull out of there. Now, since this term is negative, our answer is going to be negative for the GCF, and it's just going to be a negative 1. Next, 24x squared minus 4x. Positive term here. Both have x's, and the greatest common factor there is 4x. Lastly, negative 18x and 3. This term is negative, so we're going to stay negative, 3. And so to write my answer, 4x minus 3 times 6x minus 1. In example 3 here, we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the definition of a prime polynomial? That is a polynomial that cannot be written as a product of two polynomials with integral, think integer, coefficients. So basically, if you look at this example, 3x squared plus 7x minus 5, well, our A is equal to 3, our B is equal to 7, and our C is equal to negative 5. And you don't necessarily know these before you see these. I mean, some of these questions that you may be solving will be prime. You just don't always know that. 3 times negative 5 is negative 15. And our B is 7. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to be negative 15 that add up to be 7. Well, if we look at our factors, we know one's going to have to be positive, one's going to have to be negative, a positive times a negative to get a negative, and that the positive is going to have to be bigger to get a positive 7. So let's just start off here with 15 times negative 1. Well, that results in a sum of 14, not 7. Well, 15 we can get down to 5 times negative 3. That is negative 15, but has a sum of 2. And that's really it. You don't have a choice. You don't have an option for integers to get to 7. So when that happens, don't be alarmed, don't freak out. There are some examples that will simply be prime. Our last example today brings us to the equation for the height of a projectile. Let's break down the parts. H is the height in feet. T here and here are the time in seconds. Our v is the initial upward velocity in feet per second. And this is our initial height in feet, the h with the little 0 there. So for this next portion, I need to consult YouTube for pronunciation. So Mr. Wen's science class built a model rocket. They launched the rocket outside. It cleared the top of a 60-foot high pole and then landed in a nearby tree. If the launch pad was 2 feet above the ground, the initial velocity was 64 feet per second, and the rocket landed 30 feet above the ground. How long was the rocket in flight? So let's identify our variables first. Our height was 30. Our velocity, 64. And our initial height was 2. Now, of course, we're trying to solve for time, so we'll just leave that one out for space. But let's start off with the equation. H equals negative 16t squared plus vt plus the initial height. Make our substitutions in. Our 30 for height. We don't know our time. We know our velocity initially was 64 times the time, plus the initial height of 2. Now we want to get this to be a zero product property type question. So I'm going to subtract 30 from both sides so I can get an equals 0. What we're left with is 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 64t minus 28. Now, remember in one of the examples we could pull out a greatest common factor, and the same thing can be applied here. We can pull out a 4. So I can say 0 equals 4 times negative 4t squared plus 16t minus 7. Now, I will say though, to factor, we don't want this a term to be negative. So we could pull out another negative 1 to make this 4 a negative 4. And if you recognize that right away, then great. But if you don't, it's okay. Just pull it out at the next step here. So 4t squared minus 16t, since that's after multiplying by negative 1 or dividing by negative 1, plus 7. So again, the reason we pulled this as a negative 4 instead of a regular 4 was so that this a term, the 4 with the t squared, can be positive. Next, what we need to do is actually divide both sides here by negative 4. So we can, in a way, get rid of that negative 4. We don't need it anymore. It's not important to the problem, I suppose. So that leaves us now with the equation 0 divided by negative 4 is still 0 equals the 4t squared minus 16t plus 7. And now this is what we can factor. We have our a is 4, our b is negative 16, and our c is equal to 7. So as we look at our x, our a times c, 4 times 7 is 28. Our b is negative 16. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to be 28 that add up to be negative 16. Well, to get a sum of negative number, but a product of a positive, means we're looking for two negative numbers. And sure enough, negative 14 times negative 2 results in a positive 28, and negative 14 plus negative 2 is negative 16. So as we look to take this to our box, the first term, 4t squared. The last term, 7. And again, we're replacing the negative 16t now with negative 14t and negative 2t. And as we look for the GCFs, the greatest common factor for 4t squared and negative 14t involves a t, and it's going to be 2t. The greatest common factor, negative 2t and 7, is just, well, a 1, but since this term here is negative, it's going to be minus 1. 4t squared and negative 2t involves a t and a 2, so 2t. And then for negative 14t and 7, Well, it's going to stay negative since this is negative here. It's going to be negative 7. So as we rewrite our equation here, we have 0 equals 2t minus 1 times 2t minus 7. And we can use the zero product property now to set each of these equal to 0. So 0 equals 2t minus 1, or 0 equals 2t minus 7. And if I add 1 to both sides on this equation on the left, 1 equals 2t. Divide by 2, you get 1/2 equals t. In the other equation, add 7 to both sides. You get 7 equals 2t. And divide by 2, you get 7/2 equals t. Now we're looking for the final landing time. And so if you kind of picture it here, it launched 2 feet above the ground, kind of went to the 30 feet, and well, maybe that was the initial. Went to over the top of the 60-foot pole, and then landed in this tree 30 feet above the ground. So again, it was this arc. So over here was the first time I would say at 30. Over here is the second time when it landed. And so we're actually going to only use the 7/2 equals t, and we can actually rewrite this as 3.5 seconds. So that is it for this lesson on factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Good luck.